right, welcome everybody to Paleo Talks and happy holidays. This will be our last episode of the year, but we will be back on January the 8th. And today I'm actually going to be talking about caves and paleontology. So it'll be a little bit different. I've given one other talk in the past, and we've had a few other people that have given multiple talks, including Chris Widga, who's also with us again today, and Steve Wallace, who's on here today as well, who's been on many of these cave trips with me. And so he may chime in with some questions at some point as well. But before I move forward, David, if you could just real briefly go over the show and how it works again.
Sure thing. We're ending the year with Paleo Talks the same way we've been doing it for several months now. We're going to start off by having Blaine introduce himself, although that's a little bit redundant, I think, at this point in Paleo Talks. I think everyone knows Blaine. And then talk to us about caves, give the presentation, and then about halfway through the program, so about half an hour in, we're going to open it up to questions from the audience. So at that point, we'll remind you to start leaving your questions in the comments of the Facebook video, and we'll go through those. And as always, if for any reason you can't leave a question on Facebook, head over to the Gray Fossil Site Twitter or Instagram account and send us a message there. I'll be keeping an eye on all the social medias. And the second half of the program will just be answering questions until we run out of time.
All right. Thank you, David. Again, welcome to Paleo Talks. We're brought to you by the Center of Excellence in Paleontology at East Tennessee State University in Johnson City, where we also oversee the Gray Fossil Site. And we work on a lot of Pleistocene sites as well, and that is the topic for today. And I'm going to take this off because it's getting way too hot. So let me share my screen.
Now, Blaine, normally when we have guests on, you start out by asking them how they got into paleontology or into the work they've done. And I think that you've done a little bit of that before, but if you weren't already planning on it, can you start out by telling us what got you into caves?
You bet, you bet. Well, I'll start with talking about what got me into paleontology in the first place. And basically, a lot of people end up going into paleontology, it seems like, because of dinosaurs or an interest like that. But my background was really different. Growing up on a farm in Missouri, where I really didn't know paleontology was even an option, something that we could do. And it wasn't until I went to college and was, of all things, taking a ballroom dancing class and learned from my ballroom dancing partner that she was taking a class on Neanderthals and cavemen and whatnot. And I was interested in caves already. And so I signed up for that class. And basically that was the end of the story. I started taking anthropology classes and geosciences classes at Central Missouri State University and majored in both of those. Then went on and did my master's degree at NAU with Jim Mead at Northern Arizona University, and worked on cave faunas, worked on fauna from the Ozarks of Missouri, actually, with Russ Graham. I had worked on that project with Russ before I went to do the master's at NAU, and then just continued that on as I moved forward and took it with me. Then I went to the Illinois State Museum for 2.5 years as a research scientist. And there I was able to continue working on cave faunas with Rick Toomey and Mona, who's at the museum as well. We worked on sites in Kentucky. We worked on Ozark sites, and I was able to put together this book on Ice Age cave faunas of North America with Jim Mead and Russ Graham during that time. And as I finished that up, basically I was looking for a PhD program while I was there, ended up going to the University of Arkansas, where I worked with Peter Unger to study a South African cave site called Makapansgat, and has early hominids, and I worked on specifically the bovids. After that, immediately I'd already been talking with Wally, and I began a postdoc at ETSU in 2004, and then eventually a faculty position at ETSU, and here we are today. But since I've been at ETSU, I've been doing a lot of caving, and that's one of the things that I brought to the program, was a background in cave paleontology. And this is actually an image that Steve Wallace, or Wally, took on a trip that we went to in Middle Missouri. And right here is my light shining across this. And this is a large hole. And all of this was actually formed by a bear. So a bear had dug a hole here. There were claw marks all along here, and there was actually a deceased bear there as well. But for as far as, how did I get into caving in the first place? I found this picture a while back, and it brought back a story that I remembered hearing when I was a kid. And so the story goes back deeper in time to a story that my mom tells me. When I went caving the first time in my memory in Colorado. So we had traveled on this vacation, and we went to Cave of the Winds. And the question that I asked is, are there bears in this cave? And I said it with this really deep voice to the tour guide, and they said, no, there weren't any bears in this cave. I suspect there were probably bears in this cave based on what we know about what we find in caves now. But here I am. Here's my older brother, my mom and my dad that took us on that trip. And, even as we look at this today, we still have the same people doing the same kinds of things, which is kind of funny. So now here I am, and here's my older brother, and then caving paleo buddies and brothers here, Wally and Leopoldo Soivelson here. And this particular cave that we went to was also a paleo cave. It was a cave where we were assessing paleontological resources. And there were some extraordinary materials like tapirs over in Middle Tennessee in this deposit, including some mammoth as well. And this one I remember really well, that we really kind of felt like we were caving in a milkshake. That's what that cave experience was kind of like. We were completely wet and completely covered in this sort of chocolate substance the entire time. So anyway, my caving experience goes way back. I really became a caver officially in the 90s. That's when I started learning more about caving and doing it correctly. Now, when we talk about the different projects that we work on in cave paleontology at ETSU, there are a lot of different ones. They include sites in Western North America and in other countries as well, outside of the United States, and even in the Yucatan, where we're working on underwater cave sites. But that's not what we're going to talk about today. We're going to focus on a particular area, Tennessee and the Ozarks specifically, because I want to reach this audience in this region as well, sort of about how do we recognize these paleontological resources, because we are becoming a repository for much of Tennessee with these resources. This is an image of a bear from a cave. And again, this one is from Hoyo Negro, which is from the Yucatan. And I talked about that on one of the earlier episodes. So bears and caves are pretty much synonymous through time in a lot of different places. Now, when we talk about the Ice Age, the time frame that we're talking about specifically is right here. So the Pleistocene, where we have a series of glacial advances and retreats, and it's not really the Ice Age. We're talking about at least 22 different glacial advances and retreats over time. And during this time frame, animals are using caves when they become available for one reason or another. So all of this geologic time, most cave sites, most cave deposits, even though the rocks are much, much older, the deposits within there are less than 1 million years old in most cases. So we're typically dealing with these Pleistocene sites, these Ice Age animals. And so if we look at a little bit more history and we look at the Ozarks, this is a specimen that's being collected by Dr. Oscar Hawksley, or Oz, in the Ozarks of Missouri. He was well known. He was at Central Missouri State University. He was one of my mentors. He was already retired by the time that I went there, but he kind of took me under his wing and told me a lot about cave paleontology and his experiences. This is material that's now in the Illinois State Museum, and that is Smilodon fatalis. And there's a book of saber-tooth by Mauricio Anton with a Smilodon on the front. So as we look at caves and where they're distributed, we can look across the United States and see that we really are in the hot spot in our location over here in Eastern Tennessee. And then again over here in the Ozarks. And these are places where you have rocks that are primarily limestone and dolomite, and running up and down the Appalachian chain. We have lots of these sites with rather complex caves, And once you get out into the west, a lot of the sites are where there's erosion from rivers cutting down and exposures where you're getting these caves, and not nearly as much on the surface going into these big networks of caves as we get over here in the east. We have the Edwards Plateau, which is similar down here in Texas. And we have the Black Hills up here with their ring of caves as well. But it's this area where we have the most, and Tennessee actually has the most with over 10,000. And so it's these places where we get most of our Ice Age fossils actually. So there are other types of Pleistocene localities, but these cave sites provide the abundance of these materials. And Wally or Chris or David, if you have questions at any point, please jump in. So one of the things that we are always looking for when we go into these cave sites is small animals. And so we can look at what our questions actually are. And the questions are, the different types of animals that are in there. But the small animals are the ones that people are not typically seeing when they're caving. But it's oftentimes what we're actually looking for. And these small animals, like this yellow-cheeked vole up here that currently has a distribution way up here in Canada and Alaska, we can actually find these specimens in cave sites all the way down in Tennessee. And so these types of animals, when we find them with different distributions in the past, and if we use their modern distributions of today, we can infer that they were similar in their behavior and habitats in the past, and sort of get an idea of how they reacted to climatic and environmental changes, and whether or not they reacted individually or as groups. And so what we have here is actually from my master's thesis. This represents one bag of picked sediment, and this is all material that I didn't identify, and I actually counted this. This was 11,000 specimens. And the reason I counted it was to convince my committee that I shouldn't be spending time picking every bone out of every bag, because actually my thesis focused on the mammal teeth, which is this right here. These are the, let's see, we have different kinds of herps. We have reptiles, we have amphibians, we have shells, and we have roots and other plant debris over here. But I was convincing my committee that I should just focus on picking this material out. And then over here, we can see some of the teeth or the occlusal or chewing surface views of voles that are very distinct and can tell us their types. And the one on the right actually belongs to a yellow-cheeked vole. And
Hey,
again,
Blaine,
yeah, sure.
can you just describe briefly what the process is like of actually collecting all those fossils from caves?
So yeah, when we look at collecting these types of fossils, what we're really doing is we're doing an excavation just like you would do at an archaeological site. We're putting in a square if we can, or at least an area, and we're mapping in that area before we do excavations in levels, typically in 5-centimeter levels. And if there's any stratigraphy, then we would also note that. And then we're taking the sediment out in bags and screen washing it to look for the microfauna. So it's usually, you might see a few bones on the surface, but you're not seeing lots of bones. But if you see a few, then there is probably a lot more.
Gotcha. Cave paleontology like that, in my experience, has always struck me as different from what you picture, where you're seeing bones in the ground. With cave work, it seems like usually you're not really seeing a lot of your important stuff until you get out of the cave and you start going through it.
Exactly. So when it is the microfauna, that's correct. We don't see it. We really don't. So what this is FaunMap, which is a database that shows records of Pleistocene and Holocene faunas. Basically, these are all red dots of where yellow-cheeked voles have been recovered up here on the upper left. Then if we look at the full glacial between 15,000 and 2,500 years ago, we can see that there are records all the way down in central Tennessee. And late glacial, we still have one all the way up here in northeastern Tennessee, but by the time we get into the Holocene, when the last glaciation retreated, we don't have them anymore. We just don't have this species anymore. It had retreated. So it had sort of tracked this change in climate. And that's why these things are so important in studying how animals react to climatic and environmental change. The small animals tell us a lot more. The large animals, on the other hand, and we're really talking about large mammals here in North America, some of the questions that we can ask with them, with the megafauna that went extinct, where we have at least 32 to 33 different genera that go extinct, we can address questions like, how did they live? What did they eat? What kind of habitats did they live in? When exactly did they go extinct at the end of the last ice age? How does the timing of extinction tie in with that climate change that we're talking about and the environmental changes that we're talking about? And those are questions that we can address with other sites as well. But again, some of our most abundant fossil localities, even for the megafauna, are these cave sites. And specifically, caves can also help us address things like, did megafauna use caves? And if so, which ones? And how did they use caves? What were they doing in there? Were they denning in caves? Were they camping out, in caves? What exactly were they doing? Let's see, too far there. And when we look at this picture, one of the animals that we can see on here that does frequent caves or seems to have frequented caves in the past is the giant ground sloth. And in particular, Megalonyx jeffersoni seems to be one of those animals that used caves for something like denning or torpor or something like that. So if we look through all of these different records of these animals, we can come up with some that actually used caves in one way or another. And if you pay attention to the second column, that's the common names. The left column is the scientific name, but this is the common name. And all of those that are in black are ones that I would say are cave dwellers to some extent. So Jefferson's ground sloth, Shasta's ground sloth, both of those, although Megalonyx is more in the east, Nothrotheriops is more in the west. Florida cave bears, giant short-faced bears, saber-toothed cats, and scimitar cats have all been associated with caves in one way or another. There's even a cave in Texas where it looks like you have the saber-toothed cats hunting young mammoths and bringing them back into the cave for their young. Now you might ask about mammoths and say, surely they're not going through these passageways. And we really don't have a good record of mammoths going far back into caves. Although some proboscideans or elephant-like animals certainly did, like what we've talked about in the Yucatan. Mammoths are one of these animals that used shelters in big alcove canyon areas, and they left massive amounts of dung in some of these caves in the Western United States. If we look over here, another animal that we often find with caves is the flat-headed peccary. So all of these megafauna are megafauna that go extinct at the end of the Pleistocene, again, giving you that idea of how many different animals went extinct. And then we also have a type of muskox or shrub ox-like animal that went into shelters like mammoths did out in the Western US to use the restroom, to use the latrine basically, or to shelter from the heat.
Hey, Blaine, I've got a question on those
Sure.
lines. How do you tell the difference between an animal that was living in a cave or denning in a cave versus one that just stopped by now and then or left some poop behind and that's it?
Yeah, really good question. And what you have to do is, look at all of the available information to figure that out. And we're going to look at some examples of that. But, there's always the possibility that the animal got transported in there in one way or another. And so there are certain clues that we're going to look for, like articulated skeletons versus non-articulated skeletons, chewed on bones versus not chewed on bones. And so I have some examples we'll get to.
Okay, great.
Another one that I wanted to throw on here on the first part is, as a cave dweller, we also have jaguars here in North America. Through the Pleistocene, it was actually a larger type of jaguar that was here. They're not extinct today, but again, they had a much bigger distribution. And so we need to think about them when we think about our North American cave fauna over time. They used caves quite often, and we have a lot of sites here in Tennessee with jaguar remains or footprints in them. So as we look at different resources that we would consider to be paleontological resources, here are some of the different ones we can talk about. Animals, of course, are the most obvious in their bones and teeth. but also things like claw marks, huge claw marks in some cases in caves. Showed these teeth already. Here's a speleothem. Down here is a speleothem, and this is one that's been cut. And with that cut, you can actually see all of these little lines, and these lines can be used to study isotope, precipitation change, but also to do dating. So claw marks, coprolites, beds. Some animals like bears actually will dig out an area where they'll rest, and they'll leave a bear bed there. They're relatively common in some caves. Roosts of bats or roosts of birds of prey. Middens, we can get those from different types of rodents, particularly pack rats, will carry all kinds of things in to caves and then record sort of the local community. All of these are indicators for us of past climate, past life. The one on the bottom left is a giant short-faced bear with caver Andy Free, and that was discovered in the late 1990s. And a site that we worked on, and the material went to the Illinois State Museum. And then we have some bear tracks on the bottom right. So as we look at all of these different resources and how to recognize them, because I want to put this out there for people that might be cavers too, is looking around and recognizing. Drip holes are one of the areas that I'm always attracted to look at, especially when the drips are coming down on clay. So if we look over here to the right, we can actually see where water is dripping straight down. We're looking straight down on this clay where the water is dripping. And we see a lot of these little toothpick-like features. And if we zoom in on that, what we're actually looking at is a really extensive deposit of bats. And here we have a bat skull and another bat skull. And then all these little toothpick-like pieces are actually pieces of bats. And so you can get these extensive deposits of bats that tell you about where the bats roosted in the past. And that can actually be an indicator of what the climate was like in that cave, in that area in the past. Other places, pits, like that picture I showed of Oscar Hawksley, that saber-toothed cat fell in a pit in that cave. Crawling along, looking under ledges, crawling along, looking on top of ledges. Those are prime areas to find fossils. Pockets of sediments that are in the wall or in the ceiling even are places we find fossils that we wouldn't originally have expected. And we call those perched fossil deposits, tracks, beds, claw marks. Those are actually features that you can easily walk on and accidentally destroy. And side lighting is really the way to find that. Many of these Ice Age sites are around or near old entrances, not necessarily near the entrance that we go in today. So it's not sometimes convenient. We find these fossil sites way, maybe a mile or more back in a cave. But the entrance that that animal went in was probably a lot closer, and that entrance has now collapsed and filled in. Other things that we can look for that are relatively common is yellow or white powder. This can be other things as well, like minerals or even carbide, but in some cases, it's bones that have been stepped on, and they can show up dramatically different from the clay. Yellow or white streaks actually will show up as well if people step on bones accidentally, where your foot slides across it, because in those orange clays, the bones typically change color. They change to a more yellow to orangish color, sometimes with manganese staining. So I want to give a few examples from this project that we worked on years ago in Powder Mill Creek Cave in Missouri. And I'm always bringing in different people to work with me. And one of them that was on that project was actually my Uncle Hal there that's helping out in the blue shirt. And we are assessing paleontological resources. And this is Jim Kaufman in Missouri. And this is up on a ledge above a stream. So for the most part, when we're working in this cave, we wear wetsuits to get back to this area. But this site was found by Jim after he had done some caving with me, and he really got the eye for finding fossil remains. And this is where the trail is, where people over many, many years, 20, 30, 40 years, had been traveling along this trail. But it wasn't until somebody went in specifically with an eye looking for bone, they saw something, and then he started looking through these little pockets in the clay. And then lo and behold, what did he find is an elk moose. And this is an extinct type of moose-like animal with ridiculous antlers, more common in fossil sites that are bogs or those types of deposits. And you wouldn't expect them to be in a cave, right? This is not a cave-dwelling animal. So how did it get there? And why are we finding a series of its bones all together up on this ledge? And the way that you would get something like that in this case is because of the river itself, probably at a time deeper in time when there was a flood in there that deposited that animal in that spot, because the cave itself actually flows a river through it and sometimes carries these animal remains through it. And we found quite a few examples of this. And the site dates to about 24,000 to 25,000 years ago, and you're only about 6 feet above the modern stream, which is remarkable. This is also in the same cave, not very far from that site. And this might not look like very much. And this was actually found while we were in the cave assessing it. We were looking at some salamanders, Jim Kaufman and I, and we were going along the trail, and there were these 2 gullies where basically people's feet had gone over time, right where I have trail. So there were 2 divots along there where the feet had gone, and there was a little bit of a streak where some bone was showing through. So we went back with a bigger crew and we excavated, and it still might not look like much, but these are actually tail vertebrae right here. And this is actually part of a sloth femur. And over time, this area had been stepped on and mushed, because many of these cave specimens are really, really fragile. And especially if they're close to the surface, they'll be mushy if they're in this sort of wet clay. So looking at what we did in there, in this case, so here's Wally without a beard. If you know Wally, you usually see him with a beard. And he is doing a plaster jacket on this specimen right here so that we can safely take it back to the lab and prepare it. We're going to consolidate it. We're going to prepare it. We're going to preserve it. And then here are those tail vertebrae actually flipped over from this position, flipped over to look at the underside of them. And so what you can see is we have sloth tail in this case. We have not a lot of sloth at this particular site, but we have a tail, we have some limb bones, and we have some toe bones, and we have part of a scapula. And this represents one of the only members or types of this sloth from this area of Missouri. Here's actually a representation of the ground sloth, Megalonyx jeffersoni, at the Illinois State Museum. They've actually reconstructed several of them for museum exhibits. And doing this type of work, carrying these things out of the cave, we actually carried them out on rafts, and then you get them back to the lab and they're in these plaster jackets. You really need to have somebody who's trained, who's well-trained as a preparator. And this is Jeff Suplee doing the prep work, and he's taking off the calcium carbonate and consolidating the bone material. And then here is that actual stalactite or stalagmite, I mean, that the bone was sitting up against. And so if we go back to this point, this femur is actually resting on a stalagmite, which came in pretty handy because what we were able to do after it was removed, and here you can see where that femur was resting up against the stalagmite. This is actually bone right here. We cut the stalagmite in half. You're able to date the stalagmite, and we were able to bracket the time frame in which that bone rested up against it between about 42,000 years ago and 36,000 years ago, which is a hard time to date by radiocarbon dating. And in this case, we weren't able to radiocarbon date these bones anyway. Also within this cave system, we have some other fossil localities we went to try and confirm. In some cases, you're going back into a cave as a paleontologist to try and re-find a locality. And in this case, the Illinois State Museum had this piece and this piece of a giant short-faced bear, didn't know for sure where the locality was. So we went back in with some vague directions, like it's farther back than this point and on a higher level than the stream, and checked all of those areas. And what we had was a surface with some bone scrap on it. And we collected these materials, which matched up perfectly with these in terms of thickness and the rodent gnawing that was on them. So we refound the locality, essentially. And context is so important when we're doing any kind of paleontology. But when we're looking at these cave sites, it becomes really important. And the more disturbed the material is, the harder it is to put back together what happened. So you're putting back together this sort of crime scene, and then you're also putting back together the bones to try and figure out exactly what you have. And the difference, the big difference from being outside is that this surface that I'm on is the Pleistocene surface. And if it's well preserved, you can have those actual animals or those actual footprints of those animals. So you really are looking at these time capsules. So this comes up fairly often when I'm talking with cavers and sort of teaching what to look for. This yellow streak. So walking through the passageway, seeing something that's sort of yellow colored, if it's actually stepped on very much, it will end up looking like this. And both of these were in a trail in a cave in Arkansas. I mean, this is the same actually. So it's the same bone, but this is what it looked like after I cleaned it off. But I've seen a lot of bones that look like this after they've been stepped on. And then this is what it looked like after it was collected. And so this is a bare leg bone. But it's that recognition. And once a lot of cavers get that recognition down, they start finding things left and right. And most of these these discoveries really are made by cavers. And again, this was a giant short-faced bear in an Ozark cave where you just have the animal essentially lay down on its right side, and it only gets covered up by about that much sediment in tens of thousands of years. And only a little bit of the bone stayed exposed. And here's another one that's very similar to that, another short-faced bear that is from a Virginia cave, a relatively complete skeleton that would have been denning in there. And so it was up in this pocket of a cave where the animal laid down and it's articulated. And so it's telling us that it got in there in that fashion.
Blaine, I've got another question for
Sure.
you. You were mentioning that caves often are these disturbed environments, and you've also been talking about how much of this cave work is looking into the Pleistocene. I'm wondering, how far back can you expect to find fossils preserved in caves before the environment becomes so disturbed that you're not going to get anything anymore?
What do you mean by disturbed?
So caves are a constantly changing environment. And usually when I hear about cave fossils, excuse me, it seems like we're talking Ice Age, we're talking Pleistocene. Are there sites where you can get caves many millions of years old, or are they too altered by that point?
So typically, in most cases, what we're getting are fossils that are less than 1 million years old. And so that's the time when these caves are developing, 2 million years ago and more recently. And then once they're basically above the water table, that's when these animals are starting to use them and are starting to become deposited in them. So when these sediments are starting to accumulate and it's open for animals to move in them, that's when we get them. And so when we look at older cave sites, for example, in South Africa, they are quite different a lot of the time. Many cases, what we're looking at is actually the cave itself has filled in with flowstone, travertine, and then the cave, you can't walk through the cave in many cases, in a lot of places. You're actually seeing the exposure of the sediments at the surface, and they are breccia. So they are solidified by calcium carbonate. And then you have to take the bones out of that calcium carbonate because the caves are filled up. And so, in most cases, caves are relatively short-lived, geologically speaking. So we don't expect to find a lot of older deposits. Now, there are some that definitely date back farther, but for the most part, it is a Pleistocene record.
Okay, gotcha. And I'm going to take this moment, since we're about at the halfway point of the program, to remind our viewers that now's a great time to start sending in questions, and we'll start asking Blaine those questions here in just a little bit.
So I also want to emphasize, that the fact about caves being disturbed environments, they're not very disturbed compared to the outside environment. And most of these, these bones wouldn't last very long at all in outside environments. And you can get dramatic differences in preservation, just, from this spot over to this spot, from this spot that's a little bit higher and drier compared to this area over here where a stream is flowing through and is still active with critters living in it. So they're really dynamic systems, and you have to look at the whole picture to figure out what's going on. And this site is a site where we have extraordinary preservation. And these are all peccary bones that we're looking at, an extinct pig-like animal like you see on the lower right. And this is from a local cave. And the preservation in this site is unlike most other sites that we get in Eastern North America, because the bone is incredibly well preserved, and we even get ancient DNA out of it. And on the left is one of our past students, Aaron Woodruff, who studied fossil peccaries when he was here, both this site and to some or mostly, I should say, Bat Cave, Missouri. Also in this site, we get the preservation of coprolites, or fossil dung, which is important for us. It tells about the animals that were eaten, the animals that were eating and the animals that were eaten. And this one came from that same locality. And we don't typically get this type of preservation. And what do you do when you get a nice turd like this? Well, you CT scan it. That's one of the things you do if you can. And in this case, we took it to the hospital, and we're looking at how much bone is actually in this. And it really was full of bone. All of the white that shows up in there is bone throughout. And we think that it probably belonged to a dire wolf, which is also common in this particular fossil deposit. There are a few caves in the east where we get exquisite preservation. This one, called Big Bone Cave in Tennessee, we actually get some cartilage and even the nail preserved on giant ground sloth material. It's rare, but we do sometimes get that. Most of our caves on eastern Tennessee are more wet. We do get dry ones in the central part. Again, trackways, when we see these trackways, they sort of blow you away and make you pause and realize you are on the exact same surface that this extinct animal walked on, and that this is not a solidified surface, that this is actually still clay, that if I walk on it, I could destroy it if I accidentally walk on it. And so I encourage those that are caving, when you're in particularly a new area, what we call virgin passageway, to look at that passageway with side lighting, to investigate it and see if there are any potential tracks. These tracks that you see right here are about, I'll put it next to my head, they're about that big, about as big as a dinner plate, and they are really large cat tracks, probably belonging to the American lion. This trackway in Middle Tennessee was extraordinary. It had tracks everywhere, and it had this clay covering the surface that has huge cracks in it. And so the old paleo floor was actually cracking and falling apart. And one of the things that we wondered while he was with me on this trip is whether or not these animals were also in the cave during the Ice Age when these cracks were there. And so we started looking carefully, and they are peccary tracks, extinct peccaries. And we saw evidence that the peccaries themselves had actually slipped and fallen into these cracks and then climbed back out again. So long-term stability with many, many of these floors that you're going to experience in caves. Other sites that we get in northeastern Tennessee in particular, I haven't really seen this in a lot of other places, are these perched deposits, or these deposits where you had the cave passageway fill up with sediment, and then at some point the cave flushed out and left pockets of old sediment at higher levels that have fossils in them. And in this particular site, I'm up here and Wally's down below. We're climbing up and down this fissure, we're climbing up and down this crack, looking for fossil deposits. And we come across this one, which is up above our heads. And in this case, I'm up right next to it, right here, and it is full of fossils. We ended up getting some older type material as well, some older voles, maybe from an earlier interglacial even. And this one's even more recent. This is just from a couple of years ago, another local cave in Sullivan County. And as I mentioned earlier, when you can see fossils in the deposit like this, you're going to have so many more within that sediment. So this one we're investigating it with some students, and it was just right above my head when I was going through this passageway. And there's some of our recent students. Actually, some of them still are students. And they're pointing upward to that deposit. What we did is we wrapped it And then we did a plaster jacket. So we'll take the plaster jacket material into the cave with us. And then we were able, after it dried, to just break that loose and pull it out of the cave. And what we're actually looking at mostly in this fossil deposit, although there are a lot of rodents in it as well, is hellbender. Hellbender doesn't occur in the stream outside the cave today. They are protected. So it's pretty neat to start finding a lot of Pleistocene hellbender remains so we can compare them and their distributions today and to the past. And there that trip was after the collection. And Wally in the middle with the even more of a beard right here, but this is all we collected. And this is the type of scenario where you can't collect a lot. Another thing I want to note is the importance of working with cavers to develop maps so that you can pinpoint where your fossils are coming from. And this is a plan view map where you're looking directly down on the cave itself. And this is another one of our past students, Clinton Elmore, who worked with us for a few years on cave sites and helping us to map in a number of our cave sites as well. And of course, going into these sites, and as are Wally's legs and feet, going into these sites can be difficult. And we always have to keep in mind, where can we actually go? Where can we actually fit? How are we going to get the fossils out? So what should be collected and what can be collected really in this case or in that case, because we're limited. We can't just go in and collect really large bones in many of these sites. So this site was pretty tricky getting in and out because you had to invert yourself and then essentially shoot your body straight down for a bit before, before you could get out and through this area. And there was another spot where you had to really contort your body to get to the fossil bearing spot. So my closing comments then are, in looking at these Ice Age cave faunas, they are irreplaceable resources and they are windows into the past that we just don't get in other deposits. And so we have to really protect them in ways that are novel in some cases, recognizing these deposits, marking down these deposits, and letting people know that are going to be going into these sites to avoid those sites. They do provide the bulk of our understanding of Ice Age animals, particularly the smaller animals. They record past distributions. They also record past behaviors on many different levels. They can teach us about the impacts of environmental changes on organisms, and even the fact that our cave environments have changed by the loss of these animals. So there were many different types of animals that used these caves and contributed nutrients to these caves that are not there anymore. And so that would have changed the dynamics of these systems. And then finally, to answer the 4-year-old Blaine's question, yes, there are bears in these caves, and there are many, many bears in these caves. And I'll end there for any questions that we might have coming in.
All right, great. Thanks a lot, Blaine. That was really
bet.
cool. We've got some questions already coming in. As a reminder, everyone, you can ask your questions by leaving them in the comments of the Facebook video, or if you can't do that, head over to the Gray Fossil site on Twitter or Instagram and send us your comments and questions there. So I'm going to start out with, this is the first question that I saw from Melissa. This is Melissa Party, another Russ Graham student, former co-student of mine. You mentioned the Pleistocene jaguar early on. Melissa asks, is the Pleistocene jaguar a different species, or is this an example of Bergmann's rule?
So it's not considered a different species. Some call it a different subspecies, though that I think has a lot of potential issues with it as well when we apply subspecies to fossil taxa. And so they were quite a bit larger on average, but there are actually some jaguars from Brazil that are fairly large. So it's not necessarily a case of Bergmann's rule. At this point, we can just say we had population in North America that was large.
Gotcha. Here's another question from Charlie. This is Charlie Bruce, who says, what would you say to someone who's interested in cave paleontology but gets claustrophobic when caving, asking for a friend?
Nice, Charlie. Yeah. So go in big caves, I suppose. You know, places like Mammoth Cave have tons of potential in research. There's a lot of caves that have large passageways. And so if it's only the tight ones that you're concerned or that your friend is concerned about, go into those larger passageways. Now, certainly there also are enough collections out there that you would never have to go caving, and you could spend the rest of your life studying those fossil deposits that have already been collected as well. Wally and I started collecting fossils probably the year I got here, 2004, 2005, and in the caves. And he was really sort of starting his caving then. And we have so many projects that are on the back burner that are cave sites that we could give to students.
We've got a question from Robert who asks, any Paleo-Indian artifacts from these caves?
So we always try and avoid that. It's not our area of expertise. Really, in the cases of finding artifacts in caves, typically in Tennessee, you might find sticks that were used for torches or something like that. I've personally never found that, though I've seen stoke marks on the ceiling where they were doing some of that. Where we work on excavations in caves, I have never had an experience where we've recovered any human artifacts. Sometimes we run into human remains, earlier Native Americans, and totally leave those alone. And Chris,
Gotcha.
if you have any comments you want to chime in, feel free.
Yeah, well, you mentioned that a lot of we work really closely with the caving community, the caver community, for site discovery, for new bones, for new caves that are potential. Can you kind of walk through what a typical scenario might be for how, we get scientists involved and we start to learn more about these fossils, and kind of contribute to knowledge?
So it helps if as a paleontologist that you become involved in the caving community. And the way you do that is look for what local grottos there are. The caving clubs are called grottos, and they're all part of the National Speleological Society. So becoming part of that first and sort of letting that group know that you're interested in that and that you are a caver, which means that you follow certain rules and guidelines in your caving. That helps a lot. And then once you've established that rapport, you get emails nowadays, right? With pictures of things that have been discovered, hopefully with scales. And then we pass them around amongst ourselves and say, what do you think this is, Wally? What do you think this is, Chris? And we come up with our best guess of what it is and get back with them. And if we can, schedule a trip to go and assess the locality. Not necessarily collect anything at first, but just to assess it and see what it is and what condition it's in. Did I answer your question, Chris?
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
I know,
Right.
there's often not a typical scenario. A lot of times it is very much we're interested.
Well, most scenarios are insanely crazy and weird.
Yes.
They're all over the place. Like I think I have aliens living under my property, and we want you to come in and check our cave, or there's floating orbs.
Well, how about the person that had the hobbit living in their cave?
Well, that was one of the ones I was thinking about, and or the people that were drinking the water and they were clearly drinking contaminated water, and they were seeing all kinds of things in their yard, and they wanted us to check out their cave for fossils, and we were there looking for fossils. But the experiences that you have are priceless, as you go out and look at cave.
I was going to say the pitfall cave that we went into. It wasn't just the cave itself that was, turned out to not be the correct cave, but even the adventure getting out to it. Remember how they just sort of scattered like sticks in the wind because they couldn't remember where it was?
Yeah. So,
and we spent hours looking for that cave.
Right.
I mean,
and you never know.
I'll let you tell the story.
You really never know. You don't know when a caver says, they might send you some Polaroids, and say, these are pictures I took 20 years ago in this cave, and we want to go and see what they are. Will you go? And so you sign up and you go, and you might not know anything about this, and you end up spending 7 or 8 hours walking around in the woods in Alabama in August with all your caving gear. And,
after hiking through a cornfield first, remember.
And then you finally find the site and you rappel down into it, and it turns out when you're in the bottom, it's not a 40-foot pit, but a 90-foot pit. And all of these things happen, and it's all part of the stories that go along with these projects. Yeah. Other questions, David?
Yeah, we've got a question here from Holly who asks, are there many caves with similar fossil densities in Canada?
So yes, but there are caves in Canada, but what we have to keep in mind with sort of northern parts of the United States and then up into North America, farther up into North America, Canada, is that it's covered in glacial till for the most part. And so although there probably are deposits in a lot of places up there, they're far and few between in discovery. So they are there, but they're nowhere near the abundance of what we have to offer here.
Gotcha. This is a very lucky place to be a paleontologist.
Real quick, Blaine, you should share Chris Jazz's story about rappelling into a.
Yeah, so Chris
Since you're talking
Jazz,
about Canadian caves.
another one of our colleagues and co-quaternary paleontologist, started cave paleontology shortly after I did. He's a curator up in Canada, and he started doing some cave research, and it involved doing rappelling down into the cave. And on the outside, the entity that owned the property or was managing the property had a camera set up to manage the entrance. And it recorded something while they were actually down in the cave. And what it recorded, and they didn't even know it that day, it wasn't until they checked the game camera later, that a bear had come and checked out their rope and even looked down the rope at them.
Like look down the cave.
So, talk about, some scary possibilities that didn't happen that day. And yeah, it could have chewed the rope through, could have been waiting there when they came up, could have fallen in.
Yeah, tumbled down in. Now you have an angry, hurt bear.
Yeah, exactly. So, but, there's always funny stories that go along with caving trips.
We've got another question here from Ethan. Ethan asks, do fissure filling deposits form through the same process as cave deposits? Is that what happens to a cave eventually?
So yes and no. There's every type of possibility, and fissure fills are where you're developing a crack in the limestone, and material is accumulating in it and filtering down, and it's formed because of the dissolving of the limestone, typically in the same type of way. But the deposit itself is typically formed just by animals washing into that area that could have come from carnivore scat, it could come from animals dying, it could have come from raptor roosts, any of those scenarios. In some cases, what we'll actually see when we're in a cave is we'll run into a fissure fill. So we're going through a cave, and then all of a sudden here's this crack that's filled up with sediment coming through, and there's Pleistocene material sticking out of it. Sometimes that's coming from a cave that was up higher, or it's just coming from a depression, a sinkhole depression that was on the surface at one point in the past. And so there's a lot of possibilities, and sometimes those fissure fills, we even find them in quarries. So when quarry operations are going on, they will hit a fissure fill, and then it'll be somewhat vertical in the way that it's structured, but it's full of ancient material, sometimes dating even farther back, Pliocene or Miocene even.
Yeah, think of all the sites in Florida that are little sinkholes and fissures that they find in quarries, or even road cuts.
Yeah, exactly. And so we've investigated some road cuts and found some materials that could be older as well. And so in many cases, your best bet for finding sites that are older than Pleistocene is actually to look for those fissure fill deposits, which sometimes are in, because they're filled in, right? So they basically aren't a cave passageway anymore. They're an area that's filled in with sediments and it's being preserved. And the gray fossil site is similar to that as well. It's an old sinkhole that filled in. It's an old limestone cave collapse. And if we go down deep enough, potentially you could actually find some ancient passageways that were coming off deeper down what would have been underwater.
We've got another question here from Jenny, who asks, have European cave fossil findings been compared to those of North America, especially in regards to the distribution of microfauna during glacial periods?
Yeah, so they see the same types of things over there, where they have extensive karst and cave deposits. It's the same story, where you're getting different distributions in the modern microfauna and records of the extinct fauna. It's a different group, different suite of animals, though. You know, over there they got to have hyenas, a lot of cave hyenas actually that were utilizing some of these caves, and even things like hippos that were getting into some of these sites. And so same type of story, just different characters.
Very cool. And then here's another one. Looking to the future, Melissa asks, do you have any future field plans in caves?
Well, just a couple of weeks ago, I was in a cave. I really needed it. And I was underground with a National Geographic crew doing some filming, and we were all wearing masks. And I sort of went off on the side while they were doing some other filming and just took a break. And I sat down, I laid there, and I was just enjoying being in a cave. I love it in there. I think about the Pleistocene when I'm in there. And I looked over and I found a Pleistocene deposit. There it was, a microfauna weathering out where somebody had kicked over a rock at some point. And so it won't be too far in the distant future, I hope, where Wally and I and others can go in and test that locality. So yes, there's lots of future plans for caving, both here in Missouri, when I go back and visit my family, and the Yucatan is an active project that we're doing as well. So yes, yes, and yes.
Now we are just about at the end of our time here, but I wanted to ask one more question from myself. Blaine, throughout your presentation, one of the things that I think really stands out is how many pictures and references you have to students joining you in caves and doing work in caves. Can you talk just a bit about how the value of having these cave opportunities here for the students in these programs?
There's a lot. One of the things that adds to our program significantly is the ability to compare different types of sites. So we have the Gray Fossil Site, which is a karst sinkhole, but then to be able to take them locally to sites that are millions of years younger, but still have megafauna that are extinct and are under completely different scenarios. You're looking at sort of different captures in time in different scenarios. And the fact that you can go through these caves, travel through them, get that experience and looking for the fossils and finding the fossils firsthand, I think is really valuable for students. And both Wally and I and Chris and Josh and others have had experiences with caves that we carry with us, forever. I know that working with cave faunas myself was the best type of master's thesis I could have done for myself, because I got to look at this wide variety of different animals and try and identify them. And it was all my project. Here it was very contained. It was this package. And I had to try and identify these things and make sense out of it. And nobody else was going to do it right then. And it's this nice package that can be your project, and you can do a chunk of it, and then you can contribute that, and then other people will come along and they can contribute more to it by studying it as well. Wally, you want to add to that?
I don't know. I do think it's nice as a student to have your own little mini site,
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, our program is unique in the sense that we have the museum right there. So you can get that exposure, literally without having to travel, but having sites that are close, I think is just valuable in the first place too, because so many programs, you have to travel some distance to get to localities, usually a fairly long distance, whereas here everything's right in our backyard.
Mm-hmm.
And so we can go to a variety of different wet caves, dry caves, pitfalls, horizontal passages. You have Saltville that's only how far north, and then you have of course Gray, and it's all just right in our own backyard. So I think it's really nice to have exposed students to a lot of those different things. And normally that is our standard, is to take students on our trips and to do a lot of trips, and not just caving trips or just trips to fossil sites, just trips in general, to museums, to whatever. I think it's just more recently that students have had to deal with COVID like the rest of us. So we just haven't traveled.
So I think it is caves that provide this extra special opportunity as people that are interested in fossils and paleontology to travel back in time in a way that you can't do when you go out for a walk outside, where here you might walk by and see some dog tracks. Well, you go into this cave over here, and you might see some peccary tracks that are on the same surface that you're walking on. And so that time capsule aspect and that different rate of time that comes along with it, I think is really a special experience for students.
All right, well, I think we are just about at time. So if there's anything else you wanted to add, Blaine, before we wrap up, and if
No?
not, I guess we should just say thank you to everyone for joining us today. Thank you to everyone for joining us this year of Paleo Talks.
Right. Happy holidays. We'll see you next year.
We keep an eye out on our social media for the announcement of when Paleo Talks will be returning. It will definitely happen soon. So keep an eye out for that.
All right. Bye-bye.